Today on the Daily Bell Ringer, we're taking a look at James Monroe's presidency. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bell Ringer. Please don't forget to check out the questions down in the description. Also, I'd love to see your answer to question number 5 in the comments below. So, James Monroe's presidency, of course, he's the 5th president of the United States. He's a Democratic Republican, continuing that trend of Democratic Republicans being president, and he's president from 1817 to 1825. But let's take a look at some of the background on James Monroe. James Monroe, he's the last president who is a veteran of the Revolutionary War. All right, so actually, James Monroe, he was at the Battle of Trenton. Remember when Washington crossed the Delaware? He's actually wounded at the Battle of Trenton. He was also there with George Washington during the terrible winter at Valley Forge. But it's shortly thereafter, the time at Valley Forge, that James Monroe becomes friends with Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson kind of takes James Monroe under his wing and trains James Monroe to be a lawyer. James Monroe then, after the Revolutionary War, becomes involved in politics. He's one of the big supporters of a new constitution once we see that the Articles of Confederation are too weak to run our federal government. And so he's a big supporter of the Constitution. However, once the Constitution is written, he's kind of opposed to it because he felt like the Constitution was giving too much power to the federal government. So again, he very much opposed those Federalists that believe the federal government should have more power. During Thomas Jefferson's presidency, James Monroe, of course, was one of those people who went over to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. So he was instrumental in that. And then he also served as Secretary of State during James Madison's presidency. And then interestingly, he also served as Secretary of War for a short time from 1814 to 1815, right there during the War of 1812. But James Monroe's presidency, of course, began in March of 1817. So in 1816, he runs for president against Federalist Rufus King, and he wins very easily. And so, like I said, he gets sworn in March of 1817, and he's actually the first president to give an inaugural address in public instead of just simply giving it to Congress. Now, of course, when he becomes president, he doesn't immediately move into the White House. And hopefully you do know why, because the White House had been burnt by the British during the War of 1812. It actually isn't until 1818 that the White House renovations are complete and James Monroe is able to move into the White House. Now, James Monroe's presidency is sometimes considered to be a walk in the park, I guess you would say, because he kind of ushers in this era known as the era of good feelings. All right, the Americans, we had just won this war against the British in the War of 1812, so there's this sense of nationalism or patriotism in the United States. And it's almost like, we feel like we've proven ourselves to the international world. And so it's kind of like we got a few years here where there's kind of peace and prosperity in our country. One interesting thing is when James Monroe runs for re-election in 1820, he runs unopposed. One of the biggest issues that he deals with is this thing known as the Missouri Compromise. And I'll do another video about this, but kind of real briefly what the Missouri Compromise was by 1818, Missouri, of course, wanted to become a state. And when they applied for statehood, they wanted to be a slave state. And this is where we really begin to see the argument between free states and slave states. And because if Missouri entered as a slave state, they would throw off the balance in Congress between slavery and free states. All right. And so Henry Clay steps in. Henry Clay steps into several of these compromises during this time period. Missouri does enter as a slave state. Maine enters as a free state. And then they put limitations on where slavery could spread in the Louisiana Territory. Now, James Monroe wasn't necessarily in favor of this compromise. He felt like Congress didn't have the power to try to put limits on slavery because James Monroe was a slave owner. But he signed the legislation anyway, trying to make sure that, a civil war didn't happen. One of the most famous points in history that James Monroe is involved in is, of course, the adoption of what's known as the Monroe Doctrine, or becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine. You got to remember, by the early 1820s, there were a lot of countries in Central and South America that were getting free from their colonial powers, like Mexico, Peru, Argentina. And also at the same time, Russia was claiming that they had control over sections of the Pacific Northwest. So James Monroe, along with his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, were concerned about the role European countries felt like they could play in North America and South America. So on December 2nd, 1823, James Monroe delivers this speech to Congress. Here's a section of the speech. He says, "The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for colonization by European powers." And then he goes on to basically say any European power trying to establish colonies in America or mess with America or anything in the Western Hemisphere is going to be seen as basically an act of war, and we're going to respond that way. So this becomes a cornerstone of American foreign policy really throughout all of American history. It isn't until the 1850s that it really becomes coined as the Monroe Doctrine, but we're basically saying Western Hemisphere, we're in control, Europe, you stay out. Okay, so hopefully you learned something there, and don't forget to answer question number 5 down in the comments, and thanks for watching.